Video games have tapped into the industry as an effective medium for narrative and are rapidly growing with significant emotional effects towards its audience. What is often overlooked, however, is why and how games are becoming as successful as they are. The emotions elicited not just from the main plot, but from secondary details built upon the world that surrounds it needs to be explored. According to game studies researcher Halsey Zagal's framework in analyzing video game narrative, storytelling components are various aspects of a narrative that support and enhance the primary story, including subplots, environmental elements, and other features that contribute to the overall game experience of players. In The Last of Us 2, these components include collectibles, cutscenes, and character dialogue that reveal more about the game world and its inhabitants. By providing additional context and backstory for the characters and their relationships, these secondary components can deepen players' emotional attachment to the in-game characters and enhance their overall enjoyment of the game. The goal of this audiovisual essay is to present a potential framework for game developers so that they can design in a way that their players feel an emotional connection to their characters and understand why players would develop different forms of emotional attachment. This will be done with the backing of narrative and communication theories, case studies, and understanding through qualitative research that will assist in critically analyzing an emotionally impactful game, The Last of Us Part 2, and Naughty Dog's execution of narrative and player experience through the usage of secondary storytelling components. As a precaution, there will be spoilers of The Last of Us Part 2's storyline, and is intended for those who wish to understand the depth of its narrative. Firstly, to address attachment, we need to understand that it is a broad term that covers many meanings, including the likeness of love, liking, affection, and attraction. According to Ashbach, the most common form of attachment, love, can be categorized into 4 different types: caring, which is relative to family; romantic desire, which is a form of passion; self-transcendent devotion, relating to God's love to humanity or of a similar case; and non-personal, which is the appreciation of experiences and aesthetic objects. These forms of attachment are created through engaging player experiences and are subjective for each person. In games, its characters are agents through whose actions a drama is told, and this begins the phenomenon of player-character attachment. Any kind of emotional attachment to characters is created when characters become associated with players' memories, thus leading to the concept of identification. Communication professor Jonathan Cohen touches upon the subject of identification and how players experience the ultimate form of player attachment. Cohen defines identification as a player viewing the character in themselves as one entity. Other versions of this include similarity identification, where the player's persona is of similar alignment with the character they're engaging with, and wishful identification, where players aspire to be like a character. The way that players experience characters is created fundamentally through the social status and role of their characters. The design principle underlying this is the believability of characters' emotional reactions matching to the events happening within the game. An example of this refers to child characters, which are mainly non-playable characters, or NPCs, where Associate Professor Suzanne Eichner argues that child characters evoke empathetic reactions characterized by sympathy, care, worry, and the feelings of loss to parental concern for the character compared to identification. We can explore different types of emotional connection through a 2019 case study where Ashbach conducted a qualitative survey study consisting of 213 participants from Facebook, Twitter, and Reddit, aiming to find out differing emotional qualities that create a player-to-character attachment. The study resulted in 7 distinct forms of emotional attachment themes. In their method, the participants consisted of a diverse range, aged from 18 to 58 years old. All of them had a history of playing video games, with 31 of them involved in the gaming industry as a career. The main question for the survey was, please bring to mind a game character you really like or you really liked in the past, where the words really like was broad in the sense of hoping to result in different types of emotions, preventing romantic and sentimental connotations for everyday language similar to attached or love. The rest of the survey consisted of asking for descriptions of the character, why participants had their particular emotional response to them, and how they would react to different situations the character would be placed in. The following table are the resulting 7 different forms of emotional attachment themes that were created through the qualitative data analysis and codes. As apparent, the total does not add up to 213, as a few results accounted for multiple themes. The following diagram is a thematic map that represents the 7 forms of emotional attachment and the comparison scale in which they emphasize their functional and emotional values. In relation to our studies, object attachment to game content merely for functionality, such as bottles and rags in The Last of Us 2, can be quickly replaced, whereas player experiences with some components such as weapons and collectibles, due to their secondary storytelling background, can create emotional attachment past their utilitarian value. For this reason, we will focus on the themes nearest to the emotional end of the scale. When a player was concerned for one's protege, their emotional attachment was more often directed towards an NPC of a younger stature, where there was a sense of protection, deep concern, and worry for the character. The sympathetic alter ego attachment links back to Cohen's similarity identification, where the player shares similar experiences to the character. One of the participants in the survey compared her personal experience with chronic illness to the one experienced through Kate from Kentucky Route Zero, saying that there's a scene in Act 3 where the dialogue cuts between her picking mushrooms in the forest and her standing, panicked, outside a hospital. I've never heard anyone describe the specific feeling of that moment you realize you're going to be forever sick so accurately. I had to put the game down for a bit because I was overwhelmed. Over time, I found myself coming back to Act 3 over and over because it feels so comforting to feel understood. The attachment to a character representing the theme of a trusted close friend was described by one of the participants as having a feeling of having a friend, a real friend whose friendship is not bound by conditions of any sorts. That feeling is rare in the real world. Analyzing this case has emerged the idea that player attachment encompasses many distinct forms of emotional attachment, reflecting upon the subjective diversity of attachment and liking depending on the experiences of the player. As designers, we must delve into the topic of emotional regulation, which is the ability to effectively respond to an emotional experience. We must understand the emotional experiences that occur for players in order to analyze The Last of Us 2. Bauman and Himanova accept that emotions involve relational objects reflecting the nature of the ongoing person-environment relationship. These relational objects are referred to as emotional elicitors in the affective loop, suggested by Paiva and Yanakakis, that can be divided into two categories of game content, comprising of environment, story plot points, as well as mechanics and reward systems, and, previously mentioned, game NPCs. The affective loop, used within games, comprises of three sequential key phases within a closed loop, where 1. The player firstly expresses their emotions through interaction, 2. The game detects, then interprets those reactions within the context of the game, and 3. Based on the interpretation, the game makes adjustments through the expressions of the emotional elicitors, adapting the game to the player. A prime example of an effective loop covering both content and game NPCs in The Last of Us 2 is Abby's interaction with the Seraphites, and more importantly, Liv. Seraphite dialogue, when in an endangering situation, depicts the backstory behind Liv escaping their island.
So, should we help with the search for the runaways? Emily is taking the group into the woods at sundown. She'll find them.
It is important to take note that some dialogue refers to Liv as the apostate rather than the actual name, which can elicit the theme for concern for one's protege, as well as describing the immoral context of the situation.
The apostate! Shit.
It's Lily!
The personality of a game character can be established by the nature and strength of the emotions that the character portrays in different situations, and its tendency to act in a certain manner. Taking this into account, Liv embeds models of cognition and emotion in a believable fashion where small, yet significant changes in dialogue due to the player's actions can affect the relationship that the player has with them.
Abby, who killed that wolf? It doesn't matter. We're getting off this island. Okay. Still with me? Good. Which way? Abby, who killed those wolves? It doesn't matter. We're getting off this island.
A wide variety of emotions can range from single feeling states such as anger, fear, disgust, and joy, to higher order emotions consisting of multiple basic states of the same valence, such as jealousy, where two single states of sadness and anger are felt simultaneously. Within games, a certain authoritative assistance over player emotions of gratification, described as mood repair, can often be created when the game satisfies players' needs for competence. In-game success is a predictor of post-game mood repair. For games to achieve this, enhanced stimulation of cognitive skills, such as visual spatial attention efficiency and problem solving, to name a few, are encouraged through secondary storytelling gameplay. An example of this is the discovery of the combination that is household safe through the world's environmental law of a couple's wedding anniversary, thus uncovering asset additions towards the player's toolkit. Expanding on player agency, yet in contrast to mood repair, is the feeling of guilt or regret that is elicited when performing on-screen actions. This can be seen through enemy NPC's dialogue before Ellie delivers the finishing blow after a fight.
Please, oh God, please. Take it easy. Just take it easy. Please, please. Don't, please don't. Nice try!
These examples emerge from the argument deriving from appraisal theory, where emotions are the result of cognitive appraisal processes evaluating the personal relevance and adaptational implications of changes in the environment. This means that players that commit cruel or kind acts in a video game may not necessarily elicit feelings of pride or guilt unless they acknowledge the acts as a violation or an upholding of a respective moral standard. In The Last of Us 2, in Abby's situation later in the game, the player can be put in the situation of fighting the WLF, supposed friends of Abby, where their dialogue before final blows can be used for appraisal and analysis into how various in-game events and the player agency impact emotional responses.
Chill the fuck out! You do it. You look me in the fucking eye, Snake. Abby,
In this case, the emotional response towards Abby's actions would come to subjective judgment depending on what the player would find morally correct. This situation could potentially place the player in a complex emotional circumstance where the player would feel elements of both pleasant and unpleasant emotions, such as the simultaneous activation of sadness and happiness. In an explicit sense, these circumstances can occur through nostalgic recollections, such as when Ellie is looking around Joel's house. In The Last of Us 2, there are many instances of situations in which the player can be caught in an emotional state. From dialogue to environment and collectible components, we need to explore the depth in which the variety of secondary storytelling elements are incorporated into the game. In other words, the exploration of the embedded narrative. Embedded narrative refers to the descriptive narrative to inform the background story of the main plot. To explore this, we will also rely on emergent narrative as it refers to non-scripted narrative created by the player's actions. The two coincide with each other, as experiences through emergent narrative inform the embedded narrative, binding the events that are intended by the designer and the events that occur because of the player. Literature professor William Nellis proposes the idea of the horizontal, vertical, and modal embedding frameworks to examine the levels of depth within a narrative. Horizontal embedding is a narrative being shifted between new narrators, such as characters and objects, at a moment in time. An example of this includes short cutscenes when entering new areas and enemy AI dialogue.
Hey, be smart about it.
okay, what are we searching for?
Trespasser.
I got the one on the left. Shit again? We need more guys by the fucking walls.
Vertical embedding is when the narrative is taken to a new level where the player engages in sequences relative to the storyline, but are taken aback from the present moment. In an explicit sense, it is less diegetic. An example of this is a player having the ability to open found components, such as notes, but being able to examine it through user interface text. A significant moment that occurs involving both is when Abby finds a note written to Manny by one of his lovers. In this scene, the characters both evoke immediate emotions of urgency, confusion, and complex emotions where Abby is somewhat disgusted yet fascinated.
Oh, no. Whispering Spanish in my ear? Hey!
That's private.
Oh my god. This is your place? How many sex dens do you have in this QZ?
Modal embedding is the taking away from reality of the story world, such as hallucinations or dreams. An example of this is when Ellie has a nightmare of Joel's death, linking back to one of the 7 themes of character attachment and character emotions in game. The players in Ellie's point of view see Joel as helpless, categorized as concern for one's protege. Although it is not as prominent in The Last of Us 2, it is important to acknowledge when these moments happen to help build character attachment. Analysis of emotions in gameplay helps understand the player's connection to characters, yet our goal is to potentially create a framework for designers on how to do so. To do this, we must examine the methods and thought processes of game designers themselves on their intentions to elicit emotions within their games. A case study done in 2021, led by Bob, involves semi-structured interviews with 14 indie game designers regarding the value and practices done when designing emotionally impactful games. Through thematic analysis, it was found that while designers typically have a clear vision for emotional impact on players, they also aim to provide some space within their game to shape their own player experiences, or in other words, emergent narrative. This can be broken down into 3 themes that can be used as a chronological framework. 1. Design vision, impact players on a personal level. 2. Gameplay, creating room for experience. And 3. experiential fine-tuning. For design vision, majority of the designers aspire to create an experience that is impactful and personal to players, stating a clear vision for the feelings they wish to evoke, depicting an experience of utter loneliness and feeling disturbed as examples that are intended for players to feel empathy for game characters. Other designers emphasize the desire to convey a message, or for their players to think about specific topics, as different kinds of experiences are meaningful to different people, and that we shouldn't judge people for what is meaningful to them. For gameplay, this theme is for when designers set the stage for intended experiences, providing context to create an interesting setting, covering 3 aspects. The first is significant in setting the stage where designers consider specific mechanics potentially undermining intended experiences. As stated by developers of Gone Home of 2013, if audio diaries were the main source of the narrative and finding them was the main activity, then that would really quickly devolve into the just like of finding the cassette tapes game, digging through everything, looking for the thing that will give you the next piece of the story. This is apparent in The Last of Us 2, with players being given the choice and challenges of uncovering secondary storytelling components, where they do not directly affect the outcome of the plot. Instead, they take the form of embedded narrative, depicting the wider game world for the player to envision and understand. In contrast to activity is the idea of some designers using non-interactive settings to observe that catches players' attention. Creative director of What Remains of Edith Finch of 2017 summarizes that if there is a microscope and a knife and a chipmunk on the table, where does your eye go? What do you think about that possibility space? This is apparent in The Last of Us 2, where the player is placed in Ellie's room in the beginning of the game. Subtle nostalgic moments occur within the scene, such as Ellie's room, where she still has a no pun intended book for Riley in the original The Last of Us DLC. The final aspect of gameplay is the designer's intentions of deliberately lowering or removing gameplay difficulty to maximize emotional capacity. Games reacher Tom Cole found that emotionally challenging experiences are afforded through simple gameplay. Players need to free their minds to experience a wider range of emotions, removing that frustration and decreasing the overall cognitive load from complex mechanics. In The Last of Us 2, a prime example of this is when Abby finds notes written by past survivors from the dire moments before death, such as Abby finding the crossbow through the abandoned boat scene. This scene is focused more so on the notes themselves, away from the complex mechanics of combat, where the backstory of the people on the ship and how their lives ended leaves the player left in envisioning their own interpretation of what happened prior to present gameplay of a fully infected boat. For experiential fine-tuning, this theme is based on emotional experiences through the production. Often relying on intuition and personal experiences, designers pointed out that players were rarely involved during the early stages of production due to not fully having fleshed out prototypes. This leads to the recognition of the importance of playtesters with consideration towards production phases. A prediction and analysis for the revenge story of Boris Legasov in The Last of Us 2 can be made using this theme covering player curiosity. Storytelling component notes are left around the area, breadcrumbing from each note to the next, leading up to finding a garage full of infected. To summarize, the notes found in chronological order were from the neighbors of Boris conspiring together to turn Boris into the WLF, a military group wrongfully trying to govern their town. Prior to the WLF, Boris seemed to have been a leader of the town of Hillcrest, using his bow to fight off infected during the outbreak. The town looked to him for guidance when the WLF took over, wanting to fight back. However, when Boris took action in killing 3 WLF soldiers for killing his daughter over vandalism of their propaganda, no one took his side and thus began the conspiracy of the neighbors. The story ends with Boris's note being the last to be found, admitting to intoxicating those that conspired and sending them to their death in the garage whilst acknowledging his own downfall to infection. Without the curiosity of the player, one may have the potential to miss out on the entire backstory for when Ellie obtains the bow from the infected man, Boris himself. We can assume that without playtesting through experiential curiosity and fine-tuning, there will be no immersive gameplay to correlate to a sense of loss or interest in the story of the bowman, disregarding any emotional impact towards secondary storytelling. With these theories in mind, I conducted my own qualitative research questionnaire. The following questions were to gather general information of the Last of Us 2 community and player base, their feeling towards characters, and their understanding and effect that the game design had on their emotional connections. From this survey, distributed across multiple social media platforms such as Discord, Facebook, Instagram, and Reddit, 30 reputable responses were received, disregarding one outlier that had no knowledge of the game and had no contribution to the research. Of the 30 participants with ages ranging between 17 to 31, 21 of them were male, 7 female, and 2 preferred not to mention their gender identity. 14 of the 30 had played the game themselves, and the rest of the 16 had not played, but had seen gameplay and had knowledge of the storyline and characters. Overall, there was a mixture of those that were emotionally attached to the Last of Us 2 characters with enhanced experiences due to the narrative structure, as well as those who felt no emotional attachment to anyone with detachment and disappointment due to the narrative structure. When referring to the research participants and their in-depth answers, their naming structure will be as follows: P number for participant and their number from the 30, and number N, participant age, and N being gender identity, either being male, female, or anonymous. When analyzing this research, the types of experiences and character attachments were categorized into similar themes of Ashbrook's study of 2019. Reconstructing the themes for this analysis involves the addition of hatred as a theme, having no attachment, and slightly adjusting the meanings of the existing themes. Sympathetic alter ego is analyzed as a character in which an audience is the most familiar with, and thus will have an alternative theme, familiarity. Instead of crush, its alternative is charm, due to the lack of romantic affection. Responses to the survey resulted in a qualitative analysis that created 9 different themes, one of which included having no attachment to characters, as these participants still contributed towards the significance of storytelling components in The Last of Us 2. Evidently, there are more than 30 emotional connections, as participants often had multiple connections with different characters, causing potential overlap of themes for a singular character. This was taken into the final results, as player connections are subjective based on their past experiences and morals. Represented as a bar graph, evidence shows that the majority of player-to-character connections were based on the theme concern for one's protege. The main aspect of this theme was understanding the player's worry and sadness for characters in different situations. Yara's death was very impactful for me. Knowing she ran away to support her brother and even had her arm shattered was heartbreaking. She sacrificed herself so her brother could escape. Joel. Just having traveled through the games alongside his journey and watching him get swung at pulled all the heartstrings. This is a more detailed table of the breakdown between the themes and character relationships. It is important to note the PC, playable characters, and NPC, non-playable characters in the overall distribution of emotional connections. It creates a layer of understanding the kind of character that the designers must consider for the general player to experience for a theme. Results show that non-playable characters provide a more emotional connection compared to playable characters. This is most likely due to the familiarity and gameplay experience of the audience through the playable characters in majority of the screen space time in-game. The more a player familiarizes themselves with a character through gameplay, the idea of identification takes its place within the character. Thus, the player's actions of wanting to protect the character comes down to player agency within a story, detaching the main character from the other NPCs as someone whose job it is to decide the fate of other characters. Breaking this barrier of player to playable character through identification provides NPCs with the audience's emotional connection, whereas the more playable characters are generally provided with a more functional connection. For these results, the characters of Ellie and Abby fall under playable characters. Even though encounters involve either one of them acting as an NPC, the audience eventually sees through both perspectives, having an understanding of both characters' intentions, with emotional connection being subjective based on experiences. The results also included characters for if they were to choose to live as a character in the game. Even though initially their emotional connection was to a different character, traits and reasonings for their selection align the corresponding themes. Participant 25 describes the admirability of Yara, even though their mentioned connections referred to other characters such as Jesse, Joel, Ellie, and Owen. As she states, "Perhaps I'd choose Yara. She's pretty badass running around with a mushy arm, and I think she's fighting for a great cause. The freedom for a sibling being who they are." The breakdown of these connections has significant contributions from the storytelling component questions in the survey. Dialogue and cutscenes took the majority of player recognition, as multiple participants stated that they provide the most context in the game world building around them. Dialogue was effective, as the characters felt very grounded. My emotions were enhanced, as you can feel the characters' struggles and pain as they interact with one another. Whenever in-game, characters would occasionally exchange dialogue, which made the characters seem more alive, rather than them only talking in cutscenes. This especially helped me to grow attached to Dina and Ellie's relationship, when they would flirt and speak lovingly to each other as you progress through the level. Participant 4 expressed their dislike towards the storytelling component, yet stated their understanding. I feel a bit mixed about it. I get the picture why it was framed that way. Part of me can't help but feel it would have been more engaging if the events played out in a chronological order. The survey also provided the insight of a participant who went in depth with their answer of emotional moments in The Last of Us 2, tying together elements of this research paper with their resonation of the game's intended messages, impactful storytelling techniques, and moments in the game that enhance their player-to-character connections. Anytime Ellie sang with her guitar was sentimental because Joel taught her guitar. I liked the museum segment a lot, because it felt like a fun filler episode where they were safe, but it made lots of sense to show Ellie how the world was pre-cordyceps infection. It showed how foreign normalcy was to Ellie and fueled her curiosity about the world. There is more to it than the outbreak. I think the secondary element of being able to navigate and view Ellie's notebook was emotional and impactful, as you can understand where her head was beyond what she said out loud, with the sketches and the lyrics and the journal entries. Ellie and Abby's last fight was moving as well, for obvious reasons. Through the whole game, she wanted to kill Abby for closure and revenge, but she managed to let it go in the end. Also, the final flashback with Ellie and Joel, as she could finally remember his face without being tormented by the images of how she last saw him. This cutscene was wholesome and showed how much they cared about each other. Ellie's panic attack scene was humanizing as well and illustrated the extent of her PTSD and trauma. In conclusion, due to the wide range of player experiences, a design framework specifically tailored to individual emotional attachments between players and characters cannot be solidified. However, there are general guidelines that can influence players' emotional experiences. Non-playable characters play a crucial role in invoking player affection, worry, or sympathy through their backstory, reactions to in-game events, and immersive narrative elements, like cutscenes, dialogue, and flashback events. By humanizing these virtual characters and placing them in vulnerable situations, players feel a sense of responsibility for their fate, leading to organic attachment and emotional investment. Conversely, for player admiration and guidance, playable characters with well-designed mechanics and functionality that promote logical thinking become key to a fulfilling gameplay experience and efficient task completion. In The Last of Us Part 2, multiple characters gain favoritism for various reasons, showcasing the complexity of emotional connections. As designers continue to explore embedded narrative, leverage advancing technology, and invest in understanding their target audience, video games had the potential to become a powerful medium for emotional regulation. By crafting compelling narratives, relatable characters, and engaging gameplay mechanics, game designers can create immersive experiences that deeply resonate with players and shape their emotional journeys.
Found a rare hero card right in that ditch.
He's still collecting those things.
Don't be jealous.
I'll do my damnedest.